January 17, 1944. The wind howls through the skeletal remains of a small village on the outskirts of Stalag the 8th Sea, a prisoner of war camp buried in the frozen belly of Silesia. Snow drifts cling to barbed wire fences, their tips glittering under the weak gray sun. Beyond them, shadows move, hollow men in tattered uniforms, faces carved by hunger and cold. A German sentry stamps his boots near the guard tower, his breath forming pale ghosts in the air. Inside the camp, one prisoner crouches near the wire, his blue eyes dim, his lips cracked from thirst. On the other side, a woman appears. Her coat is threadbare, her hands trembling around a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Bread. She glances once toward the guard post, then toward the wire, calculating death with every heartbeat. When their eyes meet, time holds its breath. She kneels, pushing the bread beneath the snow toward him. He whispers something back, soft, broken, unforgettable. Words that history would never silence. By the winter of 1944, the world had drowned in war for nearly 5 years. Europe was a continent of ruins, cities reduced to bone and ash, empires collapsing under the weight of their own violence. Yet amid the smoke and strategy, a quieter battle was being fought in kitchens, barns and backroads, one of survival, morality and mercy. Nazi Germany, though bleeding on the Eastern Front, still held vast territories across Europe. Occupied Poland, France, Belgium, and parts of Czechoslovakia lived under the iron shadow of the Wehrmacht and the Gestapo. Every loaf of bread, every spoken word, every act of defiance carried the risk of execution. Prisoner of war camps dotted the landscape like silent tombs. Stalag Lufts, Auflags, and Arbeitskommandos housed millions of captured soldiers. British, Soviet, Polish, American. Men reduced to numbers, kept alive by the bare minimum, their humanity eroded by cold and starvation. According to the International Red Cross, by late 1944, over 5 million Allied POWs were being held in German-controlled territory. Supplies were scarce and food convoys were often intercepted or diverted to the front lines. In the villages surrounding these camps, life was equally brutal. Civilians lived on ration cards, trading scraps of bread or potatoes for survival. Yet beneath this desperation, the smallest sparks of compassion continued to flicker. Farmers smuggled vegetables into camps through hidden holes in fences. Children left apples on the roadside where labor battalions marched. And women, often widows, mothers or sisters of fallen men, risked everything to feed those who, by law, were the enemy. The punishment for aiding a prisoner was unambiguous: death. Posters plastered across village squares warned that any act of assistance to Allied soldiers would be treated as treason. Entire families could be executed, their homes burned as an example to others. And yet, it kept happening. In rural Silesia, reports from the German field police documented mysterious food parcels appearing near POW fences. In northern France, women from nearby hamlets were caught passing water to exhausted British airmen captured after failed bombing raids. In the occupied Netherlands, teenage girls left food in abandoned barns where Allied escapees hid from patrols. These acts were not coordinated resistance. They were instinct, a response born not from ideology but from something older: empathy. For many women, the sight of a starving man in uniform triggered memories of their own brothers or sons, lost to the same war. Their courage was not loud. It was the quiet defiance of those who refused to surrender their conscience. By 1944, Nazi discipline was fraying. Soldiers themselves began to question orders. Some guards turned blind eyes, understanding that the line between human and enemy had blurred beyond recognition. But others, indoctrinated, fearful, or cruel, made examples of mercy. In one report from the Wehrmacht Field Police, dated February 1944, a woman named Maria K. from the region of Lower Silesia was executed for feeding and communicating with prisoners of war through the camp fence. The report noted she displayed no remorse, and that her final words were, "They were hungry. What would you have done?" Stories like hers spread quietly through occupied Europe, not through official channels but through whispers. They became symbols of defiance, tales told in candlelit rooms where hope still survived. The Allied prisoners who lived to see liberation would remember these gestures for the rest of their lives. Some wrote about them in post-war memoirs. Others could never speak of them at all. But among these countless half-forgotten stories, one in particular stood apart. A moment of connection between a starving soldier and a woman who could have turned away. A moment preserved in a whisper that crossed barbed wire in history itself. That whisper, and the truth behind it, would later resurface in declassified reports, memoirs, and oral histories collected long after the war's end. It began in one of the coldest winters of the century, in a forgotten camp where compassion became treason, and treason became humanity. The story's roots trace back to a stretch of land along the Oder River, a landscape of frost-bitten fields and thin forests, where war had stripped life to its bare essentials. In 1944, this was Lower Silesia, a German-occupied region filled with forced labor camps and prisoner-of-war enclosures. Among them stood Stalag the 8th, one of several camps near Sagan, today's Żagań, Poland, infamous for its brutal winters and meager rations. By this stage of the war, Germany was collapsing inward. The Red Army advanced relentlessly from the east, and Allied bombers turned the industrial heartland into a burning wasteland. But in these rural enclaves far from Berlin's propaganda, civilians faced a different kind of war, a moral one. The prisoners inside Stalag the 8th came from every corner of the world. British airmen shot down over Germany, Soviet infantry captured during the initial Barbarossa campaign, French resistance members, some barely more than boys. Many were reduced to skeletons, their uniforms shredded, their bodies broken by frostbite and dysentery. Officially, the Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment of prisoners. In practice, Germany's collapsing supply lines and administrative chaos meant that POWs received barely enough to survive. Bread rations fell to 250 grams per day, often mixed with sawdust. Soup was little more than boiled cabbage water. Beyond the camp fences, the villagers of Silesia lived in near starvation themselves. Allied bombings had crippled transport routes, and the Wehrmacht requisitioned much of the remaining food for the front lines. Rural women often carried the full weight of survival, tending farms alone while their husbands or sons fought and died hundreds of miles away. One of those women, whose story survived through post-war testimonies, was Anna Reiter, a 33-year-old farmer's widow living less than a kilometer from Stalag the 8th. Her husband had been killed in 1941 on the Eastern Front. She worked the land alone, raising 2 children under the gaze of an occupying regime that measured loyalty in silence. Anna's farm bordered the camp perimeter. From her fields, she could see the prisoners digging trenches, carrying logs, or hauling carts through the snow. Their movements were slow, mechanical. Men turned into tools. She later told a local priest they were not soldiers anymore, just bones that still breathed. In early January 1944, Anna began leaving food near the fence. Small things at first. A turnip, a crust of bread, sometimes potatoes wrapped in cloth. She never approached too closely. She knew the guards watched. But one morning, as the prisoners were marched out for labor, one of them, a young man with an RAF insignia still clinging to his sleeve, noticed her gesture. According to testimony later recorded by the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1946, that man was Flight Sergeant Thomas E. Hale, a 24-year-old British airman shot down over Breslau in late 1943. Hale survived the war and, years later, would recall her in a BBC radio interview. She came to the fence once. Not close, just far enough that I could see her eyes. She dropped a bundle in the snow. Bread, real bread. I hadn't seen it in weeks. I tried to speak, but she shook her head. Not in fear, just sorrow. Acts like Anna's were not isolated. Throughout Nazi-occupied Europe, similar stories surfaced in Red Cross archives and post-war tribunals. In northern France, a woman named Jeanne Lemarchand was executed for feeding an American prisoner near Le Mans. In Poland, villagers in Łambinowicz faced deportation for aiding captured Soviet soldiers. In the Netherlands, local farmers risked their lives to smuggle food to hidden Allied pilots. Each act shared a common thread: anonymity. These women were not resistance fighters or spies. They did not seek recognition or glory. Their defiance existed in secret, often erased from history unless witnessed by those they helped. For the German authorities, such acts represented a dangerous contagion. the erosion of obedience through compassion. Field orders were issued reminding soldiers that kindness to the enemy is disloyalty to the Reich. Posters warned that feeding prisoners was equivalent to espionage, but no decree could extinguish conscience. In the frigid silence of those villages, many civilians discovered that the war's cruelty had reached its limits, and that humanity could only survive if someone dared to be human again. The whisper that would one day haunt history was born in that tension between obedience and mercy, between a crumbling empire and a single act of grace. And as the winter deepened, the line between survival and sacrifice blurred completely. War has a way of turning faces into uniforms and hearts into statistics. Yet even in its darkest hour, the human instinct to show compassion endures, fragile, dangerous, defiant. For Anna Reiter, mercy began not as rebellion, but as recognition. Each morning she saw the prisoners stumble across the frozen fields, their breath trailing like smoke over the wire. Hunger had stripped them of dignity, but not of their humanity. She knew that look. She had seen it on her husband's face before he left for the front. In the stillness between patrol shifts, she crept toward the fence with food hidden beneath her coat. There was no grand ideology in her actions, no political motive. It was simply this: a human being was starving, and she could not ignore it. Historians often describe these acts as micro-resistance, small gestures that did not change the outcome of battles, but preserved something far rarer: the moral soul of a collapsing civilization. Every loaf of bread, every hidden potato, was an act of defiance against the industrial cruelty of the war machine. It was a whisper against a world of shouting orders. Anna knew what it meant if she were caught. So did every civilian who dared to help. The Gestapo had eyes everywhere. Neighbors, officials, even school teachers were informants. Yet mercy, once kindled, becomes impossible to extinguish. In this, she was not alone. Across occupied Europe, thousands of nameless civilians, women, farmers, priests, even children, performed these silent miracles. Some lived, many did not, but their defiance created invisible bridges of compassion across the boundaries of war. In the years that followed, survivors would speak of them not as heroes, but as reminders that even in the machinery of death, humanity persisted, quietly, stubbornly, and without permission. For Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale, the wire was not just metal, and it was a horizon. Beyond it lay food, warmth, and life. Inside, only survival. Captured in December 1943 after his Halifax bomber was shot down near Breslau, Hale had spent months in transit between interrogation centers before arriving at Stalag the 8th C. His crew was scattered, finally 2 dead, 3 missing, 1 unaccounted for. He later described the camp as a place where days froze together into gray eternity. The prisoners were forbidden to speak to civilians. Guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles and dogs. But hunger made rules meaningless. Hale recalled how men risked bullets just to dig through waste barrels behind the kitchens. When the first loaf of bread appeared at the fence, the men thought it was a trap. "I remember we argued for an hour over it," he said in his post-war memoir. "Was it poisoned? Was someone testing us? But the smell. It was real bread. You forget what that smells like." When Anna appeared days later, he saw her only from a distance, or her hands trembling as she placed the bundle on the snow. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, but when she raised her eyes toward him, the illusion of enmity shattered. To Hale, she was no longer a German civilian. She was humanity, embodied in one fragile figure defying a brutal system. The next morning he found another bundle, smaller this time, half frozen in the snow. It contained a crust of bread and folded inside a scrap of paper. On it was written in pencil, "Keep living." The words became his anchor. In a place built to erase hope, a stranger's mercy became a weapon of survival. Years later, Hale confessed that the war's worst memory was not the bombs or the cold. It was that he could not save her when she was caught. The Second World War was not only a conflict of nations, but of consciences. Every soldier, every civilian faced the same invisible question. What would you do when right and wrong traded places? Under Nazi occupation, morality became state property. The Reich defined good as obedience and evil as compassion for the enemy. Feeding a prisoner was not charity, and it was betrayal. The state demanded loyalty, even to the point of inhumanity. Anna's defiance tore through that logic like light through smoke. She knew that one loaf of bread would not end the war, but she also knew that to do nothing would make her complicit in its cruelty. Philosophers and historians have since debated this paradox, how empathy can become rebellion. The German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, himself executed for resisting Hitler, wrote, "Not to act is to act." Anna's quiet defiance embodied that truth. The morality of war is rarely pure. Soldiers fight because they must. Civilians survive as they can. Yet acts like hers challenge the very structure of violence by reasserting the individual's moral agency. In that moment at the fence, the war's machinery paused. Orders, ideologies, uniforms, and all dissolved. What remained was one starving man, and one woman willing to risk everything to keep him alive. When we examine history's great turning points, we often look for generals, battles, and treaties. But sometimes the real pivot happens in silence, when a single person refuses to surrender their humanity. That refusal, as the coming events would show, carried a price. The Second World War was fought not only with tanks and artillery, but with obedience, the silent discipline that kept empires running. Every occupied town, every farm was part of an invisible front line, a battlefield of ideology and submission. For the German war machine, control over the civilian population was essential. Feeding the enemy, no matter how small the act, was an attack on the Reich's psychological armor. Compassion was contagion, a breach in the narrative that the enemy was subhuman, undeserving of pity. That's why Anna Raeder's actions were more than personal rebellion. They were tactical resistance, an uncoordinated moral sabotage against the dehumanization that kept the system alive. The Wehrmacht command feared not Allied armies, but the erosion of civilian loyalty. When ordinary Germans or occupied civilians began showing mercy to POWs, the illusion of total control began to crack. Secret police reports from 1944 describe a rise in sympathy acts, civilians providing food, water, or directions to captured soldiers. A classified memo from the Reich Main Security Office in March 1944 warned, "Each loaf of bread to a prisoner undermines the will to victory." The people must be reminded that kindness is betrayal. Such warnings reveal the regime's fragility. It understood that its greatest threat was not enemy weapons, but human empathy, because empathy erodes propaganda from within. For Allied intelligence and the Red Cross, these isolated gestures carried strategic weight. Testimonies of humane treatment by civilians became tools of moral propaganda, showing that even inside Hitler's Europe, not all hearts were conquered. These accounts later influenced post-war perceptions of German civilians, challenging the notion of a monolithic, obedient nation. On the battlefield, Anna's loaf of bread meant nothing. But in the political anatomy of tyranny, it was dynamite. It proved that even in a totalitarian system built on fear, personal morality could not be fully subdued. That was her quiet victory, one that no bullet or bomb could erase. When war strips men from homes and cities, women inherit the burden of survival. They become both caretakers and quiet rebels. Throughout occupied Europe, women formed the invisible backbone of resistance, not through sabotage or gunfire, but through endurance and courage in domestic spaces. Their battlegrounds were kitchens, fields, and back alleys. Their weapons were bread, secrecy, and silence. Anna's defiance was part of this wider, unspoken movement. Women like her defied occupation not with ideology but with instinct. Many were mothers or widows who recognized that compassion was the only currency left when all others had failed. In Poland, the righteous among the nations, mostly women, risked everything to hide Jewish families or feed prisoners. In France, the femmes de résistance smuggled messages and food beneath laundry baskets. In Denmark, fisherwomen ferried refugees across dark waters to Sweden. Yet after the war, their stories rarely made the headlines. Their defiance was considered too ordinary, too quiet to be heroic. History often celebrates men who destroy tyranny, not women who defy it through mercy. The Nazi regime itself understood this power. It viewed women's compassion as weakness, something to be disciplined and controlled. Propaganda posters glorified the obedient German mother, loyal, silent, nurturing only to the fatherland. Women who stepped outside that ideal, even through acts of kindness, were branded traitors. When Anna was arrested, witnesses said the soldiers treated her not as a political enemy, but as something worse, a woman who had forgotten her place. Her kindness was not seen as rebellion, it was seen as contamination. But in truth, her act embodied the fiercest form of resistance, the refusal to let cruelty redefine femininity. Her compassion stood in opposition to a regime that had turned motherhood into nationalism. She fed a stranger not because of his uniform, but because of his hunger, a reminder that empathy belongs to no flag. Long after the war, when historians began to re-examine these stories, they found that women like Anna were not outliers. They were the moral spine of occupied Europe, unsung, unarmed, unbreakable. History remembers generals and politicians. It builds statues for conquerors, not for those who slipped bread through fences. But the moral architecture of the 20th century was shaped as much by invisible acts of mercy as by victories on the battlefield. In the years following World War II, as Europe rebuilt itself, thousands of testimonies surfaced in Red Cross archives, local church records, and survivor memoirs. Among them were countless stories of civilians who risked everything to feed or shelter POWs. Many of these acts remained nameless, lost in the collapse of records and the chaos of retreat. Anna's name, too, might have vanished if not for Flight Sergeant Hale's post-war testimony. In 1946, during an interview conducted by the British War Crimes Commission, Hale described her execution and the final words she spoke as she was led away. He said she looked at him once through the fence and whispered, "Don't forget what you've seen." That whisper became the title of a BBC radio broadcast years later, What She Whispered. It drew attention not to her death, but to what her defiance revealed, that compassion, even in tyranny, could not be erased. Historians later connected similar stories from France, Poland, and Norway, forming what some have called the moral underground of World War II, a network of isolated, uncoordinated civilians who risked death to remind the world what it meant to be human. Today, war museums and memorials across Europe include fragments of these accounts: a line in a diary, a Red Cross telegram, a photograph of nameless hands passing food through wire. They are reminders that history's truth is not only written in victories, but in the moments when ordinary people chose kindness over fear. For every general who signed an order, there was a woman like Anna standing in the snow, holding bread, defying an empire, and the cost of her defiance and his whisper would soon reach its terrible peak. February 3, 1944. The wind cut across the Silesian plains like a blade. Inside Stalag 8C, frost clung to the barracks and the air reeked of coal smoke and decay. The prisoners had learned the rhythm of the camp, the guard rotations, the feeding times, the moments of silence when the world seemed to pause. That morning, Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale crouched near the fence again. His stomach ached with hunger, his fingers too numb to feel. Yet he waited, as he always did now, not for rations, but for the faint hope that came from the other side of the wire. When she appeared, she was almost unrecognizable under her heavy coat and scarf. The snow came down in slow, swirling flakes. She moved carefully, scanning the tree line for patrols. In her arms, another bundle wrapped in cloth. Anna Reiter knelt at the fence just as she had before. Hale pressed closer, his heart hammering as he whispered, "You shouldn't." But before he could finish, a shout split the air. "Halt!" Two guards emerged from behind a storage hut, rifles raised. One of them sprinted forward, barking orders. The other aimed directly at Hale, who froze, his hands instinctively raised. Anna didn't move. She stayed kneeling, the bundle still in her hands. The guard seized her by the arm and yanked her to her feet, shouting in German. Hale couldn't hear the words, but he understood the tone: accusation, fury, fear. Another guard appeared, then another. Within minutes, the scene transformed from silence to chaos. Prisoners gathered near the fence, watching in horror. Hale called out, but a rifle butt slammed into the wire near his face, sparks flying from the metal. She didn't resist. Her eyes found Hale's through the fence, calm, almost serene. She mouthed something. 2 words. He would spend the rest of his life trying to remember them exactly. As the guards dragged her away, one kicked the bundle into the snow. The cloth split open, revealing what she had risked her life to bring. 2 small loaves of bread, still warm from her oven. The interrogation began that same afternoon in a makeshift office near the camp's main gate. Records later uncovered by Allied investigators describe the event with chilling precision. The arrest report, dated February 3, 1944, reads, Subject, Writer, Anna. Crime, communication with enemy prisoners of war and delivery of sustenance. Confession obtained without coercion. Sentence, death by shooting. To be carried out on orders of Commandant Major Kruger. There was no trial, no appeal, only a signature. Inside the camp, word spread quickly. Hale learned of her fate through a sympathetic German guard, a conscript from Dresden who slipped him a note written in broken English. The woman from the fence. Tomorrow morning. That night the barracks were silent. No one spoke. The men had seen death before, but not like this, not as punishment for mercy. Hale lay awake, staring at the frost forming on the rafters, replaying every moment in his mind. He thought of her hands, trembling but steady. Of her voice barely above a whisper. Of the smell of bread. The first real bread he'd tasted in months. And when dawn came, he did what no man in the camp dared to do. He left his barrack during roll call and crept toward the fence. The guards were distracted, forming ranks near the gate. Beyond them, near a grove of birches, he saw a small gathering. Officers, rifles, and a woman standing straight, her coat dusted with snow. He could barely make out her face from the distance, but he knew it was her, a brief exchange and an officer reading something aloud. Then the sound of boots crunching snow. Then 3 sharp cracks that echoed across the frozen field. Hale gripped the wire so tightly it cut into his palms. He didn't feel it. No one spoke for the rest of that day. That night, a strange stillness fell over the camp. Even the guards seemed quieter. The next morning, a single loaf of bread was found near the fence, wrapped in the same kind of cloth Anna had used. No one knew who had placed it there. Perhaps a sympathetic soldier. Perhaps a prisoner who wanted to honor her. Hale tore it in half and shared it with the men in his barrack. No one ate quickly. They chewed slowly, silently, as though the bread itself carried something sacred, the last echo of her defiance. He would never forget the taste. Years later, in interviews, Hale described that day not as a moment of tragedy, but of revelation. They killed her, he said, but they couldn't kill what she'd done. In that place, surrounded by hate, she reminded us that kindness still existed, and that scared them more than anything. The war raged on. The Eastern Front collapsed. The camps filled and emptied again as the Reich began to crumble. But for those who survived Stalag the 8th Sea, February 3, 1944 became a sacred date, the day a woman's act of compassion pierced through barbed wire, command orders, and ideology. And as liberation approached, the memory of her final whisper would return, carrying a truth that neither time nor victory could erase. April 1945. The war was ending, though for those still trapped behind wire and walls, time itself had lost meaning. The once formidable German Reich was dissolving into chaos. Villages burned, columns of refugees choked the roads, and the echo of distant artillery rolled through Silesia like thunder. Inside Stalag 8th Sea, the guards were abandoning their posts. Rumors spread of the approaching Red Army. Some prisoners wept in disbelief. Others stood silent, too hollow to feel joy. For months they had existed only as numbers, waiting for an end they couldn't imagine. Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale was one of the last to be evacuated before the Soviets arrived. The prisoners were forced on a death march westward, through snow and hunger toward the German heartland. Many collapsed along the way. Hale survived, barely. He carried nothing but a piece of cloth wrapped around his wrist, a scrap torn from the bundle Anna Reiter had once used to carry bread. It was all he had left of her. When the war ended, the victors documented everything, the camps, the crimes, the survivors. But what Hale could not forget wasn't the horror of captivity. It was the moment that broke the pattern of hate. He told the story to the Red Cross debriefers in 1946. His voice was steady, unemotional, the way soldiers speak when they've seen too much. He described her arrest, the execution, and the whisper through the wire. She looked at me, and I think she said, "Don't forget." Or maybe it was, "Remember this." I can't be sure. But I know it wasn't fear. She wasn't afraid. She wanted me to carry it. That fragment, the whisper, became a kind of haunting, Hale could never fully recall the words, but their meaning never left him. He later said it was the only sound from the war that still followed him into sleep. In 1948, when he returned to Poland with a British delegation to inspect the remains of Stalag the 8th C, the site was unrecognizable. The barracks were gone, the guard towers collapsed, the wire rusted into the soil. Grass and birch shoots had begun to reclaim the ground. But near the western perimeter, Hale found something that stopped him cold. A wooden post, weathered but still upright, marked by a crude carving, a cross made with a soldier's knife. At its base lay a piece of brick and a rusted tin cup half buried in the dirt. Locals later told him that after the war, villagers had quietly placed markers where civilians were executed by the retreating Germans. There were dozens across the countryside, anonymous memorials for the nameless dead. One old farmer, speaking in broken English, confirmed what Hale already knew. There was a woman shot there. They said she gave food to prisoners. Long time ago. The snow was red that day. Hale stood there for a long time. Then he knelt, took the piece of cloth from his wrist and buried it beneath the post. He never returned to Silesia again. Decades passed. Europe rebuilt itself from the ashes. The Cold War divided the continent once more, and the camps of Silesia faded from memory. But Hale's recollection, that whisper, that face in the snow, refused to disappear. In 1967, he gave a recorded interview for the BBC's documentary War and Conscience. When asked about the cruelty of captivity, he paused before answering. Cruelty was expected. Kindness wasn't, and that's why it mattered. He spoke of Anna, her act of defiance, and the moment of her arrest. But when asked what she whispered, he smiled faintly. "You'll think it sounds foolish," he said. "But I believe she said, 'You must remember we were human.' I think that's what she meant. Maybe not the exact words, but that was the message." Later, historians and journalists tried to verify her identity. They found fragments, interrogation records, an execution list, and a priest's handwritten note confirming that a woman named Reiter was executed for aiding enemy prisoners in February 1944. No photograph, no grave. Only the echo of her name in paperwork and memory. But Hale's testimony, repeated, consistent, unwavering, gave her life back its shape. It became part of an oral history project on civilian resistance, recorded at the Imperial War Museum in London. On the final page of his statement, he wrote, "They said the war was a battle between nations, but in truth it was a battle for our souls. She won hers." For many who heard his story, the image of that woman, kneeling in the snow offering bread to an enemy, came to symbolize something larger than the war itself. Teachers used it in lectures about morality. Clergy spoke of it as modern sainthood. Veterans wept quietly at her name, though they had never met her. And yet, even in reverence, the story remained unbearably human, not legend, not myth. Just a single act of goodness in a world gone mad. It was perhaps the smallest victory of the entire war. But to those who survived, it was also the most profound. The whisper through the wire had outlived the empire that condemned it. And in that whisper, fragile, uncertain, eternal, history heard the faint heartbeat of conscience. When the war finally ended, the world struggled to comprehend the scale of what had happened. Cities lay in ruins, borders were redrawn, and more than 60 million people were dead. Yet amid the chaos of tribunals and reconstruction, another reckoning began. The quiet effort to understand how ordinary people had behaved when the world demanded inhumanity. In the ruins of the Third Reich, Allied investigators scoured millions of documents, piecing together stories that had never been meant to survive. Among them were brief bureaucratic lines that concealed unbearable truths. One such entry, dated February 1944, listed, "Execution carried out. Reiter, Anna, civilian. Offense, supplying food to enemy prisoners. No fanfare, no context, just a line on a yellowed page. But that single line would one day outshine entire volumes of military history." In the years following the war, the International Committee of the Red Cross and the United Nations War Crimes Commission began cataloging civilian resistance under occupation. What they found was staggering. Thousands of acts like Anna's, committed across Europe by people who had no command, no uniform and no power, except conscience. In France, entire families were executed for feeding captured Allied soldiers. In Poland, villagers shared their last food with starving Soviet POWs. even as the SS burned their homes in reprisal. In Italy, farmers risked death to hide British prisoners in barns and cellars. These were not soldiers. They were moral insurgents. And though the world remembered the battles of El Alamein, Kursk, and Normandy, these nameless acts of mercy formed another kind of front, one history almost forgot to honor. When Allied tribunals in Nuremberg examined the treatment of POWs, a few testimonies mentioned civilians who had risked their lives to help, but bureaucracy had little room for sentiment. Justice focused on the perpetrators, not the saviors. People like Anna became footnotes, acknowledged, admired, then quietly lost again beneath the tide of Reconstruction. Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale tried to change that. In 1949, he wrote to the Red Cross archives in Geneva, enclosing a statement and a request that her name be entered into their humanitarian register. His letter ended simply, "If humanity is to heal, we must remember not only those who died in hatred, but those who died in kindness." The Red Cross acknowledged his letter but could not confirm her identity. The local parish records had been destroyed in the Soviet advance, and the surviving German files listed her only as female civilian. Still, Hale persisted. Through the 1950s and 1960s, he spoke at veterans' gatherings and remembrance ceremonies, telling her story again and again. Each time, the details remained the same: the bread, the whisper, the execution. It became less a story about him, and more a testament to her, a way to give her a name, a place, a trace in the human ledger of the war. By the late 1970s, as the Cold War thawed slightly, new documents began to surface from Eastern European archives. Among them was a Wehrmacht field report confirming the incident near Stalag 8C. It listed her name, Anna Reiter, age 33, widow, Silesia. Cause of death, execution for aiding the enemy. Thomas Hale never saw that document. He had died 2 years earlier in 1975, still believing she had vanished into history. But when researchers later matched the record to his testimony, the story was finally complete. Her name was real. Her act was real. Her whisper, immortal. In a way, Anna's story became part of something larger, a movement within post-war Europe to reclaim the moral memory of ordinary people. Monuments were built for soldiers and leaders, but smaller memorials began to appear for civilians who had shown courage without a weapon. In Germany and Poland, school children planted trees in honor of those who helped. In France, the title Juste parmi les nations, righteous among the nations, was extended beyond those who rescued Jews to include anyone who risked death to save another. And in 1989, in a small corner of Jagan near the ruins of Stalag 8C, a plaque was installed. It bore no flag, no national symbol, only words untranslated from Hale's own handwriting. She fed the enemy and fed the world's conscience. The decades that followed brought silence, the kind that lingers not from forgetting, but from reverence. Europe moved forward, rebuilding its cities and burying its ghost beneath highways, monuments, and new wars of politics. Yet for those who had lived through the brutality of occupation, the memories did not fade. They simply softened into fragments, faces, whispers, the sound of boots in the snow. Among those fragments, the story of Anna Reiter endured quietly. It surfaced now and then, in interviews, in letters, in archives that smelled of dust and history. Each retelling reshaped her slightly, but one truth remained constant. She had chosen compassion when it was forbidden. By the early 2000s, historians began to re-examine the moral dimensions of World War II, not just the battles, but the human decisions that defined them. In this new wave of research, Anna's act became emblematic of what scholars called micro-resistance, individual defiance that, though strategically insignificant, carried immense moral weight. Dr. Katrin Hoffmann, a German historian specializing in civilian resistance, wrote, "Every empire that sought to control through fear was ultimately undone by empathy. The war's moral victors were not in command posts, but in kitchens and barns. People like Anna Reiter who proved that humanity is not conquered by force, only by forgetting." Hoffmann's book, The Silent Front, Civilian Defiance in Nazi Europe, devoted an entire chapter to Anna's story. It drew on British, Polish, and Red Cross archives, including Hale's original letters. For the first time, her name appeared in a modern historical record. not as an anonymous entry in a file, but as a face of conscience. The story resonated deeply with younger generations. Teachers used it to illustrate ethical courage. Filmmakers sought to adapt it into documentaries and short films. In classrooms across Europe, students read her story alongside those of Oskar Schindler, Miep Gies, and other moral witnesses to war. Yet even in recognition, her story retained its quiet dignity. There was no grand ceremony, no medals, just remembrance. In 2010, the Polish town of Żagań held a small commemoration near the ruins of Stalag 8C. Locals, veterans, and a handful of visitors from Britain gathered under gray skies. They laid flowers beneath the same birch trees where the camp once stood. Among them was an elderly woman, Margaret Hale, daughter of Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale. She carried with her a framed photograph of her father in uniform and a copy of his handwritten note. She won her soul. During the ceremony, the local mayor read a few words in Polish, then switched to English. This ground remembers not only war, but the moment mercy crossed the fence. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moved through the birches, the same cold wind that had once carried the sound of rifles. Margaret later wrote in her journal, "It wasn't grief I felt standing there. It was gratitude. Because if she could choose kindness then, we have no excuse now." In time, Anna's name found its way into the Yad Vashem archives in Jerusalem, listed among civilians who demonstrated extraordinary moral courage under occupation. It was an unofficial entry. She had not saved Jews, but her act reflected the same moral defiance. Next to her name, a curator had written, "Fed a prisoner, executed." That two-line summary, like the wartime report that condemned her, told everything and nothing. But those who knew her story understood what lay between the words, the courage, the silence, the whisper. In modern Żagań, a walking path now runs along the area where Stalag 8C once stood. Tourists pass through without knowing the ground's history, but if they stop and listen, they'll find a small plaque nestled beside the path, its inscription barely legible through the moss. To those who remembered what it means to be human, it bears no names. Because, as one local historian said, the moment you name one, you name them all. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Anna Reiter, that her act was never hers alone. It belonged to every person who, in a world of violence, chose kindness instead. Her whisper, carried across decades, had become not an echo of the past, but a warning for the future. For history, if it teaches anything, teaches this, that the smallest act of mercy can outlast empires. The story of Anna Reiter is not about victory or defeat. It is about the narrow space between them, the fragile border where human decency stands against the machinery of war. History often speaks in the language of nations and battles. It remembers the roar of tanks, the weight of treaties, the movements of armies across maps. But history's quietest truths live elsewhere, in the hearts of ordinary people who refuse to let the world's cruelty dictate their conscience. Anna was one of them. She had no power, no army, no name in any ledger of importance. Her defiance was measured not in bullets but in bread. Yet that simple act, offering food to a starving man, became something far greater than she could have known. It became proof that morality can survive even in a world built to destroy it. Flight Sergeant Thomas Hale once said, "She gave me more than bread. She gave me the reason to believe people could still be good." In the ruins of his war, that belief became a kind of salvation. When we look back at the vast, mechanical cruelty of the Second World War, it is easy to feel small, to think that compassion in such times was meaningless. But the truth is the opposite. In a system designed to erase humanity, every act of mercy was a revolution. The whisper that crossed the fence in 1944 still echoes through time. We hear it in memorials and classrooms, in the silence of remembrance ceremonies. It reminds us that moral courage does not need victory, only conviction. For wars end. Empires fall. But the choice to be kind, even when the world punishes kindness, is eternal. Anna Reiter's name may never stand beside the great figures of history, but her story endures as its quiet conscience, a reminder that the measure of civilization is not in how fiercely we fight, but in how deeply we care when fighting consumes us. And so her whisper remains, soft, fragile, unending. A voice from behind the wire, telling us not to forget what it means to be human.